Hi, this is Nish from Why Be Aligned. Welcome to another Movement Monday. And today we're going to be looking at the hips. What do we mean when we say the hip joint? Well, we mean where the pelvis connects to the thigh bone. So this joint right here. This joint is what we call a ball and socket joint. You can see here in this video from Anatomy Standard that the ball is at the end of the femur or the thigh bone and it's rolling around in the socket of the pelvis. So what are our movements of our hips? Well, I'm going to talk you through them and I'm going to use both my pelvis and my leggings because we can actually cause movement in the hip joint by either moving the pelvis, the thigh bone, or both of them. So in our sagittal or side-on plane, if I want to flex or close/bend this hip joint, what I can do is either, like I just did, raise my thigh bone to meet my pelvis, or I can tip my pelvis, what we call anterior, so it rolls forward, and that's also going to close that joint. Or I can roll that forward and bring the thigh bone up, and that's really going to close or flex that hip joint. And in the reverse, if I wanted to open or extend the hip joint, I can tuck my pelvis under, which is posterior tilt. I can take my thigh bone backwards or tuck under and take the thigh bone backwards. And that will give you the biggest opening at the front of the hip or the biggest extension. In my frontal or front-on plane, if I want to close the joint here, that's called our adduction, and that would be either I can lift my pelvis on that side, which as you can see tilts it here, which would close the joint, or I can bring my thigh bone across the body, which again closes the joint, or I could hike and bring my thigh bone in. And if I want to do the opposite, so I want to open that joint, abduction, abduction, I can either lower my pelvis on that side, which is meaning this joint is opening. I can take my thigh bone away from my body, or I can lower the pelvis and take the thigh bone away from the body, giving that real big opening or abduction. And then in our transverse plane, which is our twisty-turny rotational plane, it's easiest to think about the what the thigh bone is doing in relation to the pelvis, or what the whole leg is doing. So I can internally rotate the leg or the hip bone, and I can externally rotate it. I won't get into the ins and outs of the terminology with the pelvis, but essentially, if I had my pelvis here and I kept my leg bone still, you can see how that joint would be rotating. Alternatively, I can use my thigh bone rotating in and outwards to cause a rotation in that joint, or I could do the two together. So I could rotate the pelvis and rotate the leg in the opposite direction. And those would cause our internal and external rotations in our hip joint. Now we know the movements the hips are supposed to make, how can we encourage them back into the body if they are missing? In our sagittal or side-on plane, to flex or close the hip, we're going to take a lunge step forward or a split squat step forward. And just being careful you don't overarch your lower back here. Try and have a neutral lower back, but you're going to bend down in that front knee. So we know that this is bringing the thigh towards the pelvis, or the thigh bone towards the pelvis. So that's closing the hip joint. And then we're going to roll the pelvis forward and over. So we're doing this movement with our pelvis, our anterior tilt, and that's also going to close the joint. So I'm really closing or flexing this hip joint here. And then I'm going to stand up, and to open or extend that joint, I'm now going to step that same leg backwards, and I'm going to, with a nice straight leg, tuck my pelvis under or posteriorly tilt the pelvis. So that is when I'm thinking about the tailbone tucking under. And when I do that, what I want to make sure is that as I tuck under, I don't bend this knee, because we know if we bend the knee, it means the thigh bone is coming back to the pelvis. So as I've tucked under, I straighten my knee, and you're going to feel a real opening or extension at the front of that hip joint. In our frontal or front-on plane, we know we can use this up and down seesaw motion of the pelvis, and also taking the leg away from the body Well, another way to take the leg away from the body is by taking the body away from the leg. So I can keep my leg fixed, but essentially by bringing my body weight towards my other leg, it's the same as if I was to take my leg away. So we're going to use a block or a step or a couple of books for this, and you're going to place one foot out onto that block. I want you to have your big toe knuckle, little toe knuckle and heel on that block so you feel nice and steady. And your feet ideally will both be facing straight ahead, so north on a compass, and also your pelvis is going to face north. And you're going to simply let this front leg, knee, start to bend forward. And hopefully you can see as I bend into that leg, because that's on a block, this side of my pelvis is going up. So we're starting to close or adduct this hip, and we're starting to open or abduct this hip. And now if I bring my whole body, using my bum, but bring my whole body towards this leg, I shift my weight over. You can see this is now really closing this joint and really opening the back joint. So as I come in and out of that, I'm actually able to adduct this joint and abduct this joint at the same time. So I come forward onto that block, starting to lift on this side, and then I shift all my weight over here, and that is going to give me this closing here and opening here. In our transverse or twisty turny rotational plane, it can get a little bit complicated if the thigh bone and the pelvis are moving at the same time, just because to try and move them in towards each other or move them both out towards each other at the same time is a lot to think about. It might sound simple, but it could be a bit trickier. So we're actually going to single them out. So we're thinking about our thigh bone initially. And if I rotate my thigh bone so it's coming in towards the body, that's going to give me an internal rotation at the hip. And then if I think about my thigh bone rotating out away from the body, that's going to give me an external rotation in this socket. Just being careful, it's not just your foot going in and out here. You can see that is still moving my bone, but if I really think of it from the thigh bone and the hip, I get a lot more rotation in that joint. So focusing on this thigh bone. Alternatively, try and pin those thigh bones still. So as if they were two sticks pinned into the floor or two poles pinned into the floor. And you're going to rotate the pelvis. So I'm going to put my hand here so you can see my thigh bone, and my pelvis is going to start to rotate that way. And if I keep my thigh bone where it is, it means that my pelvis is moving closer to my thigh bone. So I'm getting, again, that internal rotation. Whereas if I keep my thigh bone where it is and I move the pelvis away in the opposite direction, you can see how my hands are traveling further away from each other. So I'm getting an external rotation in this thigh or hip socket here. So you can either use your thigh bone or your pelvis to get that twisty turny rotation in the hip joint. So now you know what the hip joint does in all three planes of motion, and you also have some practices you can use to try and encourage those movements back into the body. Give the initial movements a go. See if you can feel a difference on your right to left side in each of the planes of motion, and see what your body needs. It might be that you've got loads of hip flexion on your right leg, but loads of hip extension on your left leg. So give your left leg some more flexion, give your right leg some more extension. See what your body needs. But it is vital that we've got those movements in the body. If we don't, we know that somewhere else is going to have to make up the slack. Or with our hip joint, if everything's not quite moving right, it can wear out too easily or become really stiff and give us problems that way. So make sure you've got lots of lovely fluid movements in those hip joints. Remember that vision of the ball and socket rolling around, and give the practices a try. Never do too many. About 5 reps is more than enough when you're doing them well. And don't forget, follow, like, subscribe, and head over next week for another Movement Monday.